Hello and welcome back to London Cycle Routes. Today I'll be showing you how to cycle from Notting Hill in West London to Kew in South West London. This ride takes about half an hour and you can do more or less the whole thing on quiet streets and protected cycle lanes. By public transport, the same journey takes nearly an hour and generally requires a change of line, so you're saving a lot of time by cycling this route. If you find this video useful or you just enjoy watching it, then please don't forget to subscribe to the channel on YouTube, as I try to post new videos just like it every week. Alright, let's get going. So we're starting outside Notting Hill Methodist Church on Lancaster Road and we're going to head west. The first thing I'm going to show you is how to get across the Westway safely in this part of London. For those that don't know, the Westway is this massive elevated highway that cuts its way across London. It was originally supposed to be a part of a much larger motorway network, but thankfully most of it was never built. Unfortunately, it has left this part of London quite difficult to get around by bike and quite car dominated. But here I'm going to show you a sneaky way to get across it. We're actually following a signposted route here called Cycleway 27. It's not actually a great route for a lot of its length, but this particular section crossing the Westway is good. Look at the floor here and you'll see it says C27. Following those arrows and signs is the easiest way to remember how to get under the Westway, which you can see above us just here. You really wouldn't want to be cycling on that, and this is much more pleasant. If you paid attention to the map at the beginning, you might have noticed that the first bit of this route is extremely wiggly. It isn't direct at all, and we'll actually double back on ourselves a bit. I considered whether that was a problem or not, and actually I decided that it wasn't, and the reason I decided that was the public transport timings. Despite the indirectness, it's still twice as fast as taking the tube or the bus, so it's certainly still a really useful route. Latimer Road, which we're on right now, is probably the most egregious example of going in the wrong direction. So we're actually heading north here, even though Kew is very much south of Notting Hill, and as you can probably guess, we're going to be going south even further. Also, as you probably judge from that overtake, Latimer Road is not a brilliant road to be cycling on. It's relatively quiet, but there are still cars here and they drive quite quickly. One of the reasons for that is that we're actually in the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, which is renowned for its terrible cycling provision. It's also generally just quite a car-dominated part of London, partly because of the Westway, but partly because of other traffic policies that Kensington and Chelsea has. For quite technical reasons to do with parking permits, Kensington and Chelsea actually gives all its residents free parking everywhere in the borough, which means that they use their cars for short trips that you wouldn't normally expect people in London to use cars for. It really does show even the quieter streets in the borough aren't very quiet. Fortunately though, we were only on streets with traffic for a very short period of time there. It was a minute or two at most, so hopefully it doesn't spoil the route too much. The next section of our route is through a big park called Wormwood Scrubs. If that name sounds familiar but you can't quite place it, it's because it's the location of the prison, Wormwood Scrubs. And yes, it's still here and it's still open. I'll point it out to you on the left in a minute. But for now I should just tell you that these paths are obviously shared with pedestrians, so make sure you don't ride too quickly. The surface is really quite good though, and you can also see that there are still signs pointing you for C27, which is the route that we've been following since more or less the start of the video. If you're wondering what that fencing on the left is, by the way, that's actually the Wormwood Scrubs Pony Centre, so you can come here and do horse riding. We won't be following Cycleway 27 for the whole of the video, but for now the signposts are quite useful to let you know which direction you need to go in, as there are quite a few forks in the road. Just to note, by the way, that this footage is actually quite old. You can probably tell from the weather. It was filmed last summer. That's one reason it maybe doesn't look quite as sharp as some of my other new videos which were filmed on my new and much better camera. If you need any help following the route, you can always download the map that I provide for all my videos, and you can find a link to it in the description below the video. It's on a website called Komoot and you can download it, and it gives you a GPX file which you can use on whatever app or device you choose to use. That said, though this first bit of the video may appear wiggly when you watch it, it's actually pretty intuitive to follow because we're really just following the directions for Cycleway 27. Now, I promised that I would point out the prison, and if you hadn't spotted it, it's there on the left. The prison was opened in 1875 during the Victorian era, and in its time it has seen quite a lot of history. More recently it has imprisoned the rock star Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones, and also Pete Doherty, the lead singer of the band The Libertines. I always find prison architecture kind of interesting because when people say something looks like a prison, they usually mean that it's like modernist and concrete. But actually, prisons in London especially do tend to actually be quite ornate and Victorian. As we leave Wormwood Scrubs, we briefly go on to Braybrook Street and then we turn left following the signs for C27 down Eckrenwald Street. This is a great name for a street. It's actually named after Eckrenwald, who was the Bishop of London from the year 675, so a really long time ago. I think the Anglo-Saxons generally had great names, and I really enjoy seeing them in place names. Whenever I've been on these streets around here, they've always been relatively quiet, and the architecture is also quite interesting. It's sort of an arts and crafts style. Makes everything look quite cottagey, even though you're actually really in the middle of a city. It's not a style of architecture that I'd like to see everywhere in London, but I think this is a really interesting example of how it's been done quite well. Now, you may remember that I said we'd be doubling back on ourselves a bit in this video, and also that we crossed to go north of the Westway. Well, now we will be crossing to go south of the Westway. So really, we just wiggled around north of the Westway to go on quiet streets. It would have been much more direct just to go right down it, but as you can probably see, it's not really a particularly pleasant cycling environment. There were plans nearly 10 years ago now to run a full cycle track down the Westway, which would have been really convenient for us here, but unfortunately they didn't happen. We're making do here on a brief section of shared pavement, which isn't fantastic, and we also have to cross this road here. There are actually 4 crossings to go across here, you can count them, although they were all green at the same time, which is good. There's then another relatively short section of shared pavement here until we get on to the start of this really quite nice cycle track. This is really good and a massive improvement on the shared pavement we just came on. In fact, I wish it was extended a bit further in the direction we came from to cover the area with the shared pavement, and I don't really know why it wasn't, because it would have connected really well to the cycle crossing that we used. I don't know for sure, but this looks like it was probably funded with what's called Section 106 money. So in the UK, when a developer wants to build a new development, like that one on the left there, they often have to contribute some cash to build some local infrastructure around it, like schools, maybe a NHS clinic, or maybe a nice cycle lane running alongside the main road. That kind of looks like what's happened here. It might also explain why it doesn't connect to the existing infrastructure very well. Just a note, as you may not be able to tell from the video, there's actually quite a gradient on this and it's a bit of a hill. Your cue to turn off is when you get to this bridge, and you can go down the little ramp here. It's a little bit twisty and turny, but it does get you down without having to dismount. It drops you at the top of Perrin Road. This first section of Perrin Road is a cul-de-sac, so it doesn't have any traffic on it. It does get a little bit more busy further down at its southern end though, especially after you pass Shah Road, which is used as a cut through for traffic. The parking on both sides of the street makes things a little bit narrow, so even a couple of cars down here can make it a little bit problematic to get down the road. It's not anything that we can't handle, and it's definitely a little bit better than in Kensington and Chelsea, but if they really wanted to make this a comfortable cycle route, then the borough should consider introducing a low traffic neighbourhood here. A filter on the left would make a lot of difference. Ealing did have a really ambitious low traffic neighbourhood programme during the pandemic, but unfortunately it has effectively taken almost all of them out now. There's a very short section on East Churchfield Road here, which is no fun to cycle on. It looks quiet now, but you can see that level crossing on the railway just ahead. When those barriers are down, there are often long queues of cars waiting, so it's not always the most pleasant place to cycle. We then cut through Acton Park, which is a really pleasant park. Unfortunately though, it does close at night, so if you need to do this route when it's closed, you'll need to take East Acton Lane, which basically runs parallel to the park here, and loop around and join it. At the end of the park there's also a crossing. You can use that toucan crossing on the left there, but I just crossed the road regularly as there was a gap in the traffic. Mansell Road here is also a cul-de-sac and relatively quiet, although it does have a depot on the end at the left, so sometimes you might see lorries going in and out of it during business hours, which can make it less pleasant to cycle on than you might think. We then go onto the shared path at the end and head through Southfield's recreation ground. These paths are relatively nice to cycle on, and you can see that they've been resurfaced relatively recently. It's quite a nice smooth surface. They're reasonably wide as well for the number of people who use the park, but don't forget that they are shared with pedestrians, so make sure you give priority to people who are on foot. At the southern end of the park, there's an improvement that I'd like to see made that I think would be really simple. We have to cross this road here, but it actually looks quite busy. You can see there's a few cars, and it would be great to have a zebra crossing leading into the park with a joint cycle parallel crossing that allowed us to have priority over that street. I think it would be really helpful, firstly for the cycle route, but also for people accessing the park. We are actually technically following an official TfL cycle route here. I say technically because there haven't really been any improvements made to the route. It's really just a load of signs directing you through some back streets which aren't even filtered. When I came here a year ago, the only signs here were these old blue London Cycle Network signs from the 1990s, and you can see a few of them on poles like that one on the left, and also one just here, which basically tell you that this is a cycle route. I think TfL is probably going to be putting in some new Cycleway signage, which will probably be a little bit more obvious and easier to follow. But really, I don't see the point in signing a route as a cycleway if there aren't going to be some improvements or just cycle infrastructure made, even if it's something like removing half of the parking to create a bit more space and putting in some sinusoidal speed bumps, or more ideally, improving the crossing that we just talked about, or putting in a modal filter to make sure there's no through traffic on here. That said, it is a relatively quiet route, so it is definitely the best way to get where we need to go. It's just that I think a bit more ambition would be nice, and I think there's a risk that the Cycleway brand gets devalued if you just end up re-signing old London Cycle Network routes. We're about to leave Ealing and cross into the London Borough of Hounslow, which is, despite being an outer London borough, really quite good with cycling. And what they've done here is they've actually closed the space under the railway bridge to traffic except buses and cycles. So you're guaranteed an easy run under this bridge, although do obviously be aware that the occasional bus does pass through here, so don't just jump into the road without looking. Given that excellent improvement has created a great cycle route down here by really reducing the traffic on these streets, another little improvement that could really finish it off here would be to turn this street up here that we're just about to head through into a contraflow. You can see there's a one-way sign, and that's great, but if you're coming in the other direction, you actually need to take a different street. So if you added an accept cycles sign here, so it was two-way for cycling on there, then you'd actually have a great symmetrical cycle route, and it would make the whole thing a little bit less confusing and just more convenient. We've now crossed onto Chiswick High Road. We're in Chiswick, and you can see we've got a great protected cycle lane here. This is another TfL route called Cycleway 9, and it is really very good. I've done lots of videos down here. Unfortunately, we're only on the protected lanes for a very short period of time, and then we quickly turn onto Heathfield Terrace. This street is not awful to cycle on. As you can see, it's relatively wide, and there also tend to be a lot of people on bikes here. But it is, I think, nevertheless a shame. That's because Cycleway 9 is fantastic. It's got a really long protected cycle lane behind us all the way to Hammersmith, and there'll soon be a big long protected cycle lane at the other end of this street all the way to Brentford and then to Hounslow. But unfortunately those two lanes will be connected by this street, which, while not awful, is actually not a fantastic environment for cycling on. It is a bit of a rat run. You can see that there are rather large cars using it and not going particularly slowly. So I would say that this street really badly needs a bus gate to remove through traffic from it. That would complete Cycleway 9 and do justice to the rest of the route, which is brilliant. It also just makes sense from a traffic planning point of view, as this street runs basically parallel to the A4, which is effectively a motorway at this point. And apart from being a really important cycle route linking east-west across London, it's also primarily residential, so it makes a lot more sense for the traffic to use the main road. This end of the street here has already had through traffic removed. That's because the western end of Wellesley Road has actually been closed with a filter, and therefore through traffic doesn't continue down here. So it really makes sense, I think, for the rest of the street to get the same treatment. And you can see what a difference it makes. There are no massive SUVs overtaking us, and it is generally just a much better ride on a bike down here. By the way, if you're enjoying this video and you'd like to see more like it, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. And I'd also like to say a massive thank you to everybody who supports the channel on Patreon. The channel doesn't have any bonus episodes or anything like that. All the content is free and open, but if you find that you're watching all of them, you might consider joining the Patreon, as I really do welcome everyone's support and it does keep me making videos every week. You can find a link in the description below the video. Now, that segregated cycle lane we were just on there is going to continue down to Brentford and to Hounslow soon. Hopefully in the next year or two they'll start building that. But we've actually turned off it and we've gone on this shared pavement along Kew Bridge. This is a shared pavement. There are blue shared space signs on it at various points if you keep an eye out for them. But of course pedestrians, there's one there, but of course pedestrians have priority, so make sure you don't go too quickly and you give everybody a wide berth. It's not great, I don't really like shared pavements, but it certainly gets you over the bridge and it's not usually too busy. It does get a little bit crowded at this end though and behind the bus stops. And it dumps us here by Kew Green, which is where we're going to end our ride. So we've come all the way from Notting Hill, really probably Ladbroke Grove is probably a more appropriate name, but no one really knows where that is, all the way to Kew. And you can see that's a really wiggly route at the beginning, and we were really just avoiding the Westway, so it would be great to be able to kind of just go down that, but that's not possible at the moment, really, not in a comfortable way. And there are other ways you can do this, but I think given this only takes half an hour, and by public transport you're looking at closer to an hour, the wiggliness doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter what it looks like on a map. What matters is how nice the ride is and how quick it is, and I think this is a really good balance. So thanks for watching. Make sure you hit subscribe if you haven't already, and thanks to everybody on the Patreon. Let me know in the comments what you think below, especially on matters that I discussed in the video, but I'm also always open for listening to ideas for new routes or places you'd like to see explored. And I will see you again next time. Goodbye.